Well, hello everyone. This is our second attempt at doing this today because we had a few technical issues this morning, but we are now all here. And this episode is entitled What You Reading? Because Matt has been telling us about some of the books that he's been reading recently. So I said, let's make that a common room. So Andrew and I are going to talk about what we're going to be reading, but we're going to give the lion's share of time to Matt to tell us about his particular books that have been captivating him for the last month or so.
Nice. Well, I just was in Cedar Key, which had been swamped by the hurricane, but I was doing some supply work. I presided and preached at Christ Church there on Cedar Key, but they had a place for me to stay, so I went up a day early, and I had talked with my spiritual director, so as kind of a devotional retreat day, I read all the way through Till We Have Faces in one sitting. And so it took me about 10 hours, but I'd never read the book start to finish, and I think I have a better sense of the sections. So,
David, is Andrew a little quiet for you?
No, Andrew sounds great to me.
You sound a little quiet.
You sound a little quiet, actually. It's your problem.
Andrew's probably 20% of what you are to me.
Huh.
And he was earlier on Zoom too, which made me think it wasn't Riverside, so I was bringing it up. But all right.
Well, I got my mic right there.
Yeah. No, we got. Maybe Satan was trying to stop this because he knew it was going to be a really beautiful conversation, and we, due to the grace of our Lord, was able to push through.
Yes.
And we are here. Hopefully you're actually able to hear me.
Mm-hmm.
Got a couple other things on the shelf. I'm reading through my hardback full color collector's edition of The Silver Chair in anticipation of the C.S. Lewis retreat. And also I wanted to show you what I learned in Bible college about how to prepare and open a new book. And so when you get a brand new book, you open the covers, and then you flatten them out, and then you take about 20 pages on each side, and you flatten them out, and so on until you get your book nice and ready to go. So, Silver Chair before the Lewis Retreat on October 13th through 15th in Texas. I'm doing my honorary Inklings class, so I've got the nice annotated Orthodoxy and Are Women Human by Dorothy Sayers. Short answer, yes. Letters to a Diminished Church. The Mutual Admiration Society, How Dorothy Sayers and Her Oxford Circle Remade the World for Women. So I'm doing, I'm looking at how the honorary Inklings influenced Lewis and gender. And then reading through some George MacDonald for the Divine Feminine in The Princess and Curdie, The Princess and the Goblin, and At the Back of the North Wind. And finally, while I'm about to depart for Wheaton for a week and a half of research, and David and I will meet up there, and I have an appointment with the Reverend Professor Amy Peeler, who's an Episcopal priest and a Wheaton professor, and she wrote a book called Women and the Gender of God. So I'm looking forward to dipping into that before we have lunch with her. So
Do I dare
that's
ask
my rundown.
what that book's
What's
about?
that? Women and the Gender of God. She's actually, I think, taking a relatively traditionalist. I think there's some controversy in there, but I think that it's going to be a good. Let's see. Amy Peeler shows how the Bible depicts a God beyond gender and a Savior who, while embodied as a man, is the unification in one person of the image of God that resides in both male and female. So
It sounds correct.
yeah. And she published on Erdman's.
Due to my expert theological knowledge of multiple PhDs and master's degrees and stuff.
Yeah. So I'm looking forward to dipping into this.
Even if it's a little bit different, I love reading views different than myself when they're well sourced and cited, because I think that's really helpful when someone actually lays out how they got to it, and you can kind of see and you can decide, I disagree with this jump that they made right here.
Yep.
When it's systematic and it's done well, that's just really helpful. And it's just, honestly, it furthers the discourse. Even if there's something, I'm not saying with this at all, I'm just using this as a launching point. If there's something that I think is against truth, but it was well thought out version of a different thing that allows truth to articulate itself better. And so it really helps the discourse, I think. And I love that you're going to read, and I think that'll be cool. I kind of want to read that.
Yeah, no, I think it's going to be really good. It was highly recommended by some people I really respect. Lewis said, when one has read a book, I find there's nothing so nice as discussing it with someone else, even though it tends to produce rather fierce arguments. And he says, I think of Eliot, maybe not of Eliot, but of somebody said in literary manners, to find an opponent is almost to find a friend. So yeah, I think that you're spot on about the potential of literature. What about you, David? What's on your shelf?
Yeah, so I've actually been reading quite a lot recently, and I've been posting what I've been reading to our Slack channel. So I went back and had a look at what I've been reading over the last month or so. I started with Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, which I'd never read before, and it's basically about, imagine Jordan Peterson in a concentration camp trying to understand the meaning of life. That's basically what this book is. Very provocative, very thoughtful, shocking dark, because it's life in concentration camps. He spends a lot of time talking about it. And speaking of Jordan Peterson, I've actually read his 12 Rules for Life in its entirety. I'd read bits of Peterson before, but never actually gone through his most popular book. And so I went through that, and that was some parts of it were fantastic. Other parts of it, with each of the rules, he attacks them in a different way, and I thought some worked better than others. But the big read was The Scarlet Pimpernel, which is actually my wife's favorite fictional book. She's been trying to get me since we started dating, and unfortunately I kept falling asleep every time.
She reads The Great Divorce a week into meeting you, and you can't read The Scarlet Pimpernel until like 2 children later.
Exactly. Got to make her work for it.
Oh my goodness, David.
But I do have to say, it was well worth the wait. Because for people that don't know The Scarlet Pimpernel, he's basically James Bond during the French Revolution. He's sort of sneaking into France, getting the aristos, the aristocracy, and sneaking them back to England because the French Revolution is in full force and they're cutting the heads off everyone. And so I was expecting it to be kind of like a James Bond thriller style book. And it's actually not that at all. The primary focus is not the Scarlet Pimpernel, but his love interest and about their relationship. And in the background of all of that, all of these escapades are happening. But it was absolutely a phenomenal read. If people haven't read it, I thoroughly recommend it. I can now see why Marie liked it so much.
Well, and I can also recommend it. It's one of Kristen's favorites, and she's in talks with a publishing company to do kind of a Christian commentary and summary of the Scarlet Pimpernel. So
Wonderful.
She just finished up Princess and Curdie. One of the two. She just finished up doing that, and Scarlet Pimpernel and Persuasion are the 2 others that she's being considered for. So.
Well, Persuasion is Marie's favorite Jane Austen. And Lewis's.
And that's Kristen's favorite Jane Austen. And it was the book that we talked about the day that Kristen and I met. And so I was texting her all the funny bits from Persuasion that night, and that's what hooked her. So we should probably do a cross podcast discussion about 18th century, 19th century literature.
Yeah. No, I think that'd be fun. But yeah, so Scarlet Pimpernel, that was the real standout. I also read several books on Islam and biographies of Muhammad. And I also read The Making of the Ordinary Saint by Nathan Foster. Funnily enough, someone on a Muslim discussion board had recommended it to me, because I've been going and looking for the Muslim who loves C.S. Lewis, because when we did the Ecumenical Month, we had an Orthodox Jew who really loves Lewis. So I thought, surely there's a Muslim out there who also loves Lewis. And I found a few. And when we were talking about what other books they liked other than Lewis, Nathan Foster was one that was recommended. And it's sort of riffing off his father's work, Richard Foster, who wrote The Celebration of Discipline. And that I was familiar with. Yeah. And I would say this is just a more casual, informal discussion of those ideas. And Matt, I think you would actually like both his father's book and this book. They're very much down your alley in terms of like let's get a program up for spiritual excellence. I think you would like it.
Well, that's a perfect segue into
Well, hang on. Before we do that, I have two more books that I've been working on. I'm doing Jack and Dorothy.
I've been doing this one book for like maybe 2 months, and David's done about 8 books.
By the way,
12,
I want to hear about Dorothy and Jack. One of the things that a priest friend recommended doing, we've been reading about de-churching and why people de-church. And as a ministry and as a part of my own spiritual self-care, I'm thinking about taking just an hour a week to walk the 2 blocks to our main street and sitting in a coffee house with a book and just do an hour's worth of theological reading, but be there in my collar in case anybody happens to come up and want to chat to a priest. So I need to make time for some more reading.
Whenever I've held Bible studies that have been under my control, I always do them in public for that reason. There's one that I did it for like 2 years straight. Every session, we'd always have someone come up to us afterwards and want to chat of very varying beliefs, but they saw what we were doing and they would have questions or wanted to share their own story. No, I think it's well worth your time. You might get a free drink out of it as well.
Yep, absolutely.
But yeah, before we hand it over to Matt, my 2 Lewis-related reads. One was Jack and Dorothy. Gina Delfonso, we've had her on the show before. Thank you.
Dorothy and Jack,
And it's focusing on the relationship between Dorothy L. Sayers and C.S. Lewis. I figure since both Andrew and I are going to be at the Wade next week, I better make sure that I've got some Dorothy L. Sayers under my belt just in case Crystal Downing turns up and wants to talk. But the other one that I've read, and this was a surprise, this was The Dark Tower and Other Stories.
Oh, yeah.
Because Andrew did his interview with a guest on...
Junius Johnson
on The Dark Tower. And I had not read it, so I read it. And I also read the other stories that were in the collection. They're, I would say, varying quality, but they all have like an idea that Lewis is exploring. Every single one. And you can see sort of what he was cultivating, what he was working on. And some of them are absolutely hilarious. The one, actually no, I'm not going to spoil it. All I'll say is each of the stories are great. It's also got the light story, which I discussed.
You were thinking about Ministering Angels.
I was thinking of Ministering Angels, it's very funny. Just don't take it too seriously. And
it's
it
like
also
a Star Trek episode, like an original series Star Trek episode.
Sure. Yeah.
Anyway.
But it's got that and the work which I discussed with Charlie Starr on light. So it's called The Man Born Blind, which is and all of them are very provocative and well worth some extended discussion at some point. So I think we might we might actually have a common room on each of those stories at some point.
Yeah, after 10 years too, right? Is that in there? The story about Menelaus returning?
Yes.
Or Helen's return. Yeah, it was originally called Menelaus Golden Hair. And it's one of the pieces of fiction that Jack, it was one of the last pieces of fiction Jack worked on, and he worked on it, I believe, after Joy died. And of course, Menelaus Golden Hair is waiting for his wife Helen of Sparta to return, and Helen was the woman that Lewis was missing when he was trying to write that story. So,
yeah, I told my wife the storyline to that one, and she was pretty shocked. So, I think it's well worth a discussion. But that's enough of my rambling. Matthew, let's hear about these books you've been reading.
Yeah. The one that I was sharing in the beginning was Fulfillment of All Desire. And it's by Ralph Martin. And it was recommended by an individual kind of end of June period, early July. And so it's probably been one of the more inspiring / transformational books I think I've read. It goes through the lives of 5 of the Western saints. Catherine of Siena, St. Francis de Sales, Bernard of Clairvaux. St. Therese of Lisieux, and I don't remember the 5th one. haven't clearly gotten that far yet. And it's just been, it does draw on Augustine, but he's not considered one of the five. It's really been profound. And I think the thing that I wanted to talk about a little bit was a concept I never really thought about. That apparently, so what this does, it goes through their spiritual journeys, it goes through their lives, it pulls on some of their theology, but it also just talks about their lives in general and really builds this of what does it look like to live like a saint? And what were some of the spiritual gifts the Lord had given them? And how can we draw inspiration and draw wisdom from their journeys? And I think of St. Francis de Sales. Actually, I'll say this. The first one, I won't go down this path too much, but the first one that hit me, that led to me going in a Eucharistic adoration for like 2 hours at night, and I'm doing a confession with the priest, was actually Catherine of Siena talks about the 4 torments of hell that she was given this vision for. And those were brutally, like, they smacked me in the face. I think one of them was she got to see the full, true manifestation of Satan and what we become. I think of Lewis, a heavenly hellish creatures, but do you really actually take a second to ponder what it will look like to become a truly genuine heavenly hellish creature in the worst sense of it, in the perpetuity? And I think it's kind of hard for us to rationalize what that person looks like, how empty it was, how hollow it was. And I think that just lit something under me. And when you just see how we get to see a very seductive, tempting Satan in a day-to-day life, really trying to seduce us into saying no to God in little ways. And so that really stuck out to me. But the thing that I would say challenged me too was St. Francis de Sales, in Introduction to the Devout Life, really talks about how the devout life is not a whole bunch of exterior practices, devotions. I mean, those are manifestations of it, but it's a transformation of the heart. And so he talks about what that can look like. He talks about if you're someone who's feeling really called and inspired, step 1 is yes, mortal sin. Let's really focus on some of the gravest sins that you might be doing in your life. But another step in that journey is, and this, I'd never heard this before, was getting rid of the affection for sin. That's a really big sign of a transformation of the heart. I never heard that term before, affection for sin. And how often do you think and say, oh, well, if I wasn't Catholic or I wasn't trying to live a holy life or Christian, and oh man, the way I would live would be fun. But that's not true. That shouldn't be appealing. Like the transformation of heart should show, like David, I think back to yours and my video series we did a long time back. And I'll never forget when you said the 10 Commandments weren't God looking down at us, seeing all the fun things we could do in life and saying, thou shalt not. I mean, that's not what the teachings are. I mean, the Christian life is meant to give us the fullness of joy. Like when we feel that transformation of heart, we should feel a deep sympathy and almost like a pity for the other type of lifestyle and desire to continue living the way we are. And I guess I'd never really heard that term before. And I thought that was like something that's not talked about as much, the affection for sin. And there's been times when I'm reflecting with college buddies, and actually it becomes a thing that I'm really trying to focus on now of, I've had a lifestyle change, hopefully much for the better from before that. But sometimes you'll be talking with your buddies from college and you'll be telling stories and stuff, and you're speaking of things that really you wouldn't do today due to your journey, but you're talking to them about a bit of a callous, flippant, way. And it's like, no, that's we're dribbling in this affection for sin area here. So yeah, there's a lot more. This book is really profound. I would say it's going with David. It's a very Matt-esque book. I mean, this thing just packs a punch constantly. I mean, literally just taking the lives of saints and condensing it into just truth. Wisdom. Inspiration. Spiritual journey.
And we have dealt
It's
with
almost
this
as if-
affection for sin quite a few times, and specifically in one season. And there's a line in that book, there's always something they insist on keeping, even at the price of misery. There's always something they prefer to joy.
Mm-hmm.
The great divorce.
Yes. And we all know that joy points to love. And that's the substitute. The affection. I was struck by the term affection. God will, or the enemy will even use affection, God's tool and gift, got one of the four loves, to tie us to this world. I wish Lewis had commented something about it. It's too bad that he didn't say in Mere Christianity that God cannot give us a happiness and peace apart from himself because it is not there. There is no such thing.
Yep.
So,
I mean, it's amazing how all of these things I just listed are more or less covered in some different degrees in Lewis. I mean, David, you just brought up the Great Divorce. I think that really does fit into this. The heavenly, hellish creatures, what you just said, Andrew. I mean, those are all the same concepts I'm just bringing up right here. I mean, Lewis is remarkable, honestly.
And it's the Screwtape Letters. This is what Screwtape wants, the nurturing of affection. Beginning, first of all, in the imagination, then the intellect, and then ultimately let that play out in the will.
Yeah. And the desperate need in Orwell to be approved and to be petted and to be reassured. And it's the kind of self-centeredness, the inward spiral that all of that stuff turns us to. And I was struck by the interview with Rowan Williams where he just talks about, and this is a guy, you heard him, he pulled out some random 2nd century theologian off the tip of his tongue.
Thanagoras.
But yeah, exactly. But he comes back to Lewis again and again and again, and contained in Lewis, more than anybody else I know, are all of these things about which I care the most, and almost, I haven't read enough Augustine, but Lewis is just, he's got he's thinking about all of that stuff. And when people ask me why I love Lewis so much, I just tell them frankly, because he cares about everything. He gives great wisdom about everything I care about the most. And he leaves nothing out as far as I found.
What? You two? I thought I was the only one.
The one little quote I'll read before saying my second book that I think is really beautiful. They would like very much to commit sins if they could do so without being damned. I thought that kind of summed up that section. And that's just the wrong mindset. Now, the other one. I'm only 60 pages in right now, 65. I'm reading this with my girlfriend, which we've not told anyone.
What?
Yet.
You're who?
She is in our prayers daily.
She's been in our prayers before she showed up, and she's going to stay there.
She's in my prayers, too. This is one of her favorite books, and so we're reading it together. He Leadeth Me. By the way, total side thing on that. She's been listening to the podcast pretty much all of season 2, bunch of after hours stuff, and I keep thinking to myself, what did I say? She's like, I listened to Sister Miriam James. It was so great. I'm like, going back to that one 2 times speed. Did I say anything I need to? But He Leadeth Me, Father Walter Chesak. And I'm only a bit in here, but there's one really beautiful thing I came across. I did thought this would be really worthy of sharing. He was in Poland, priest, really felt this calling, and this is right when World War II is beginning. I think 1937, 1938 is the period I'm at right now. He felt this call to go to Russia to work and they're not with Hitler, but there's still some pretty negative stuff going on there. There's some intensive work camps that are very impoverished circumstances being used, and so he felt this desire to go there. And he really wrestled with the calling. Was this God's will? And discerned it was, then discerned away, and then discerned it back, and then went. And here's the part that I thought was really profound. He really struggled because he got there, and because of the propaganda of Russia or the Soviet Union at the time, there was no respect for priests. And so actually, effectively, I'm not sure, I'm quite aware of how long it was in this period, maybe 6 months, 9 months, whatever it was. He didn't get to do anything. He didn't administer the sacraments to anyone. He could go there and pray, but everything he thought was going to be a beautiful thing never got to play out while he was there. And he mentions how he really went into a state of like despair, a bit of depression, was really struggling. So I guess what I'm trying to share is imagine painting this picture of you felt really deeply called to God's will in this moment, and then you go and it's not manifesting the way you thought God's will was going to play out. And then your anxiety, your depression is because of that disconnect of what you thought. And so a big part of it was he had this great realization. He snuck away a couple times with his other priests that he went there with and did their own solo kind of masses in the woods he was able to do. And he was able to find strength in that, in the sacrifice, the mass. But he realized, and I think this is a really great lesson for all of us, what we think God's will is. We might be right of like discerning the will to go, in his case, to go to Russia. At least at this part, he doesn't say that was the wrong choice. But he was incorrect in discerning, like, I don't even want to say it was incorrect. He was incorrect in what he thought it was going to look like on the day to day, and that created a lot of turmoil interiorly until he realized you take the day as is, and you trust the Lord is bringing it to you, and you accept the suffering that comes in that, the whatever it is as it comes. That's what I'm learning so far from this book, He Leadeth Me. I'm a little further now. He's in this Lubyanka type thing in Russia, which is a much more intensive psychological prison where he's isolated. And again, I'm reading this and I'm thinking to myself, it sounds like he's going to be here for years. I'm not entirely sure yet. He has no interaction with anyone. He's in pure isolation. So now imagine, and I just share this for listeners who could use this. Imagine you've thought you've been wanting to do God's will or been discerning something, and now for years you see no manifestation of it. How painful would that be? And I think of a modern day worldly example of this a little bit was Jesus from The Chosen, Jonathan Rumi. I've not heard his story, but one of my buddies went to his testimonial and he said he's 47 years old. He'd been like the acting space pretty much failing. He had no money in his pocket, but he always felt God called him to this. And he had nothing to show for it for like a decade and a half. He's struggling as a man, sounded like. I mean, literally, he had like $20 left to his name. He gets on his knees and said, God, like, I felt like this is your will. It's about time you do something. I think it was like pretty quickly there. He gets a call to be Jesus in The Chosen, and it's like the most perfect role for him to evangelize to hundreds of millions of people. But I just think that's a modern day example of this, that just because we're doing God's will doesn't mean there's not going to be a really struggling period. So anyways, I will pause there. Or stop because we're kind of to the end.
Milton was going blind. It's similar to Beethoven going deaf towards the end of his life. And as Milton is literally losing his sight, this man who had made his living from his poetry, he writes a sonnet called On His Blindness, and says, when I consider how my light is spent ere half my days in this dark world and wide, I can quote the whole thing to you. And God does not need, he says, man's work or his own his own gifts. Who best bear his mild yoke, he serves him best. And then concludes with the famous line, they also serve who only stand and wait. And so who knows what happened in Russia while this priest was there praying for the people. And maybe none of the people ever responded, but maybe their grandchildren did, and maybe a church or a revival or something, took place. And it's hard to see. Lewis says we don't really see the tapestry. We only see our particular thread, and we don't get the big picture.
Of people that have read this.
Yeah, yeah.
Yep.
So, yeah.
Well, I think that's a
David, real quick,
good point to end. I haven't. Maybe I'll add it to my list. I'll talk to you soon.
You'll probably beat me down with it, let's be honest.
Well, it depends whether or not there's an audiobook, because I still live in a house with 2 small children who don't like me reading ever.
Am I able to gift audio credits? I have to pause mine. I got 6 built up right now, and I'm like, they just kept charging me. I don't know if I can gift them.
I'll find out if you can transfer them to me.
Figure out, because I literally I got to pause this and just because this is a 10-second rant. Amazon does not make it easy. You need to go to a web browser. You can't do it on your app. They do not want you pausing this thing. It is a nightmare to figure out how to pause it.
Yeah.
They just want you to read more.
Yeah.
You're right. Way to phrase that the right way.
And I just want to toss in to our listeners who are not Catholic, one of the great things about the Catholic Church, and having been a nothing and then all kinds of evangelical and now in a liturgical tradition, one of the great benefits that I got once I became aware was there's a certain amount of Lone Ranger syndrome in the or they can be in the evangelical church, where it's me and my Bible and my interpretation of whatever sermon that I'm hearing. And I'm not disparaging. I don't use evangelical as a term of disparagement. I still hold it proudly. But one of the things that happened once I began reading about church history and becoming part of the liturgical tradition is this sense of a peopled world. And I remember it really clearly, actually. It was during a trip to Oxford, and I think it was at Magdalen College, Oxford. Just looking in, I couldn't go into the chapel, but you could look in, and they had row after row after row of saints. And I think one of the great benefits that the Catholic Church has to offer to convinced Protestants is this sense of a very peopled cloud of witnesses that surrounds us. And so many people in the past have been trying to follow the gospel with all their hearts. And I think that some of those, that the saints' lives become, really good examples for everybody, not just for Catholic readers. And so if you're an evangelical and don't know what to make of all of this, dabble around, look around, and find a saint that you may enjoy. And
read The Fulfillment of All Desire.
Yes.
And I'll put it this way. If you want to become wise and holy, hang out with those who are wise and holy, whether they're living or whether they're dead. Just read their books.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or use your audio credits if you're Matt. Anyway,
I got to finish
cheers.
with one tiny. Well, I got to finish with one little mini funny thing with The Fulfillment of All Desire. I told my grandmother I'm reading this, and she goes, "It's Jesus. I don't need to read the book. It's Jesus." I'm literally like, "Grandma, you're the best." I'm like, what could help you on the spiritual journey? Well, you see, that's the problem with your generation. You guys need all to overthink it and stuff. It's just submit to Jesus. I'm like,
well, and
right.
It's not an opposition between the Catholic saints and the evangelical commitment to the Scriptures. The Scriptures themselves say that we are one body with many members, and we are all members of one another. And so there was a multiplicity of the peopledness of the Christian faith that I found when I began poking around. And I love what Lewis says in the preface to Mere Christianity. He says, past all divergences of taste and differences in religion, something or a someone speaks with the same voice. And so your grandmother was exactly right. What happens in all of these portraits is that we get to see Jesus.
I love it. Good note to finish on.
Cheers.
Cheers, everybody.